The air in the palace is thick with lavender and lye, yet beneath the velvet lies a rot that no fragrance can mask. In the hush of Elizabethan England, where torches flicker against tapestried walls and the air hums with superstition, a queen sits upon her throne, resplendent in pearls, lead paint and silence. But even in all her glory, something foul lingers just beneath the powdered surface. This is not a tale of scandal, nor of politics or war, but of soap, skin, and the strange rituals of royal cleanliness. It is a story of illusion, of appearances so carefully preserved they almost erased the truth. And yet, the scent of it all still clings. If you stood in her presence, would you smell rose water or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments and tell us where you're listening from and whether it's morning, evening, or night. Now dim your screen. Let the air grow still. Let the century turn back. She sat beneath a halo of flickering candlelight, her face a mask of powdered porcelain, unmoving, ageless, and almost not alive. The hush of her presence was broken only by the gentle whisper of a servant's sleeve as he backed out of the room in practiced silence. The Queen, Elizabeth, daughter of Henry, mistress of an empire, remained still. Her dress rustled faintly as she breathed. Or was it the heavy folds of brocade settling around her limbs like the petals of a dying rose? Outside, the chill of late autumn clawed at the leaded glass windows. But inside the chamber, the air was warm, not from fire alone, but from years of human closeness, of layers upon layers of scent and silence and secrets. You might expect the room to smell of pine wood and lavender. You would be wrong. Beneath the layers of pomander air and dried rose petals, there lingered something older, something vaguely sour and earthy, like wool stored too long in a damp chest. This was the smell of myth and of a body untouched by water. Elizabeth, I was not unclean in the way the peasants were, trudging through mud and dung in London's alleys. No, her filth was curated, disguised, and softened beneath silks and scents. Her purity was political, her cleanliness a matter of state. And yet, if you drew close enough, if you dared to truly see her, to breathe her in, you might find yourself questioning everything you thought royalty would smell like. But no one ever dared that. Instead, her courtiers bowed low. They studied the movement of her gloved hands and hung on every syllable of her practiced, silver-dipped speech. They admired her glowing skin, never knowing that beneath it pulsed a layer of finely ground lead and vinegar, slowly seeping inward with each year. They believed the myth because they needed to. Her rise to power had been nothing short of miraculous. A girl born of scandal and political upheaval, transformed into the Virgin Queen, untouched by man, untouched by blemish, untouched by the human needs of the flesh. It was a story that required a body preserved. And so, her rituals were born. Each morning, or what passed for morning in a world without clocks, she was transformed anew. Her ladies-in-waiting approached with reverence, careful not to breathe too strongly or speak too loudly. The Queen's skin had to be protected, not from dirt, but from scrutiny. A concoction of vinegar and white lead formed the base of her famed complexion. Thick as clay and deadly as betrayal, it clung to her like a second skin. Each night, it was gently, and only partially, removed with oil-soaked cloths and cautious hands. Water was never poured, baths rarely drawn. To wet the skin was to invite illness. And illness, in Elizabeth's case, meant more than pain. It meant weakness, rumour, danger. And so she stayed dry, dusted, preserved. The corridors of Whitehall whispered with stories even then, that she never bathed, that her body was never seen, even by her closest servants, that her wigs, tall, curled, majestic, hid more than a receding hairline, that even her scent was chosen by ministers of state. But in truth, Elizabeth's hygiene rituals were not unlike those of her time, only elevated to an art form, veiled in layers of ritual and performance. Her bed linens were changed often, not merely for comfort, but as a form of dry washing. It was believed that frequent changes of undergarments, especially fine linen shifts, helped draw impurities from the skin. And so, the Queen might go weeks, even months, without a full bath, but she would slip into fresh linen daily, with a tendency to warm and scent the fabric before it touched her body. Can you imagine it? The feel of warm, lavender-scented cloth against your skin in the dead of winter, not from a dryer or fire, but held close by another human until it reached the perfect temperature. And yet, even these rituals could not fully shield her. Beneath the leaden linen, her skin suffered. Sores appeared. A faint smell, metallic, oily, began to accompany her. The ladies whispered of the Queen's complexion, but never to her face. They knew better. Still, she reigned, impossibly powerful, terrifyingly poised. The myth held. For the people outside the palace gates, the Queen's body was never meant to be human. It was sacred, a symbol of divine right, of order, of England itself. If she had bathed in rosewater only once a year, then surely that was enough. If her breath carried a trace of clove and vinegar, it was not halitosis, but holiness. If her fingernails bore the faint yellow of tinctures and unwashed hands, they were simply the marks of majesty. No one questioned the contradiction, not in public. But deep within the palace, among the linens and ointments, in the whispered confessions of maids and the notes of apothecaries, the truth flickered like a candle left burning too long. The Queen was mortal, and like all mortals, her body told a different story than the one she wore. Still, each night, the fire was stoked, the lead was removed, the gloves peeled off. A servant, always the same, always silent, massaged rose oil into her hands, cracked from age and chemistry. And Elizabeth, alone with her reflection, stared into the mirror, not with fear, but with command. She was not beautiful, she was not young, but she was untouched. At least that's what the world would believe. And so, the mask was applied again. Outside, the bells of London tolled softly in the distance, echoing across the damp rooftops. The city breathed, rank, chaotic, very much alive. But in her chamber, Elizabeth remained still, a statue in lace and lead, a queen bathed in myths and shadows. The Queen's palaces rose like gilded islands above a sea of filth. Whitehall, Hampton Court, Richmond, each was a world unto itself, with its own rules, rhythms, and scents. And oh, the scents! If you were to step inside the palace walls in the year of our Queen, you would first be struck not by silence or splendour, but by smell. The first layer was floral, lavender, rosewater, crushed bay leaves, carefully prepared and tucked into sachets, wardrobes, sleeves. Scented gloves made of the finest Spanish leather were soaked in ambergris and musk. Courtiers pressed them to their faces when passing through the corridors, shielding themselves from what lay beneath. For beneath it all was the stink of humanity. Even the noblest body, perfumed and powdered, still sweat under layers of velvet and silk. Chamber pots overflowed in corners. The rushes strewn across the floors, once thought to freshen the air, now trapped grease and rot, soaked in the leavings of dogs, people, and the crushed remains of feasts past. But for Elizabeth, scent was strategy. She understood the politics of perfume. It veiled discomfort. It demanded distance. It cloaked any hint of illness, weakness, or decay. To approach her was to enter a carefully scented sphere, where everything, from the orange blossom oils dabbed behind her ears to the rosemary-scented ink used in her letters, served to project vitality and divine favour. The plague, however, did not care for perfume. It crept silently into the court through the breath of a cook, the sleeve of a visitor, the wood grain of a carriage. Each summer, as the heat rose and the flies returned, so too did death. The Queen would retreat to safer estates, but not before precautions were taken. Quarantine was a familiar word, even then. If a servant fell ill, they were quietly removed, their clothing burned, rooms fumigated with vinegar, sulphur, and bitter herbs. Physicians in bird-like masks whispered advice behind gloved hands. And yet, Elizabeth stayed remarkably untouched by these waves of pestilence. Some said it was her devotion to cleanliness, though she rarely bathed. Others pointed to her diets, her royal blood, her divine purpose. But those within the palace knew the truth was simpler. It was control. The Queen controlled who touched her, who approached, who breathed her air. Her food was tasted, her clothing fumigated, her rooms cleaned not with water, but with dry cloths and sharp-smelling tinctures. She did not wade into the life of the court. It waded carefully around her. Even so, the palace was never truly clean. In the great halls, the smell of cooked meats clung to the beams. Beeswax candles mixed with sweat and smoke. The privies, even the royal ones, reeked despite the herbs scattered across their seats. The Thames, flowing just beyond the windows, carried refuse from thousands and returned it with the tide. And so, the courtiers masked the decay. They carried pomanders, small metal orbs filled with cloves, cinnamon, and crushed flowers, dangling from their belts or hanging from chains around their necks. A courtier might lift one to their nose 12 times an hour, not for fashion, but survival. For those closest to the Queen, the rules were stricter still. Ladies of the bedchamber were required to keep their hands scented and gloved. No one entered without permission. No one spoke too loudly, for fear of spreading not just impropriety, but contagion. The Queen's personal spaces were ritually maintained. Every object, from her hairbrush to her prayer book, had its place and purpose. Yet even these rooms bore the marks of human life. Beneath her great canopied bed, the floor bore scratches from chamber pots pulled hurriedly in the night. The embroidered cushions on her chair carried the faintest trace of old sweat and lavender oil. In the long shadows of late afternoon, dust motes danced, visible proof that no power, no matter how divine, could hold decay forever at bay. Still, Elizabeth resisted water. Where modern minds might reach for soap and a basin, her court relied on linen cloths, vinegar washes, and dry rubs of crushed herbs. Washing the body too often was believed to open the pores, and with them, the gates to illness. Instead, to change one's shirt, one's gown, one's stockings, this was the true path to purity. And so, the laundresses worked without end. They scrubbed fine linens in caustic lye and river water. They dried them in the smoky sun and scented them in cedar-lined trunks. They ironed each fold flat with stones heated over open flame. The Queen never saw these women, but she wore their labour like a second skin. It was said she changed her shift daily. a luxury beyond imagining for most in her realm. The shift, soft and thin, absorbed the body's oils. It was the front line of hygiene, and when it was removed, it was not simply discarded, but studied. Servants looked for signs: sweat, discharge, blood. The Queen's health was a matter of state. Still, no one spoke of what truly lay beneath her clothing. There were rumours, of course, that her skin had turned grey from the powders, that ulcers bloomed in the crooks of her arms, that her breath was sweetened with pearls of candied anise to mask decay. These whispers, if heard by the wrong ears, could end a career or a life. But behind closed doors, the reality was undeniable. The Queen's body, like the palace itself, was carefully curated, dressed, perfumed, maintained, but never truly clean. Not as we would understand it. And yet, in this carefully constructed world of scent and silence, Elizabeth reigned with terrifying clarity. She knew that appearances held power, that a well-placed glove or a crisp, clean ruff could silence doubt, that in a world where the very air carried death, to smell of jasmine and civet was to declare life. Even her letters smelled of her. When foreign ambassadors opened her correspondence, they were greeted not only by her words, but by her presence. The scent was deliberate, a subtle reminder that she was not to be trifled with. Can you imagine holding such a letter, the ink still damp, the wax seal warm from the hand of a courier, and the scent of the Queen herself, lingering like a warning? In this world of palaces and plague, perfume was not vanity. It was armour, and Elizabeth wore it well. Now, let us step deeper, beyond the scent, beyond the veil, into the private sanctum where the Queen's body was prepared each day, and where her ladies carried out their most delicate, unseen duties. Let us walk quietly now, for the next room holds secrets known only to those trusted by a woman who trusted almost no one. The great corridors of the palace teemed with courtiers, scribes, pages, and shadows. But there was one figure who walked among them almost unseen, despite his station: the Queen's Lord Chamberlain. He was no ordinary noble. His was not a role of speech or spectacle, but of silent service and invisible power. Few outside court circles ever understood the full extent of his duties. To the common eye, the Lord Chamberlain organised entertainments, arranged audiences, and oversaw household staff. But behind closed doors, he was the gatekeeper to the Queen's most private world. And within that world, personal hygiene, or rather, the meticulous illusion of it, became a state responsibility. Each morning, before the Queen stirred from her bed, the Chamberlain would confer with her closest ladies. They whispered in tones low enough to be mistaken for the wind, exchanging notes on linens, ointments, powders, and the condition of the Queen's skin. It was not vanity, it was surveillance. The Queen's body had to be watched, not with lust but with loyalty. Every blemish, every change in odour, every new sore or rash could signal illness. And illness in the Queen was more than a personal concern. It was political instability. It was fuel for gossip. It was danger. The Chamberlain knew this, and so his tasks became rituals. He oversaw the delivery of fresh water, not for bathing, but for washing cloths used to wipe the Queen's face and hands. This water was boiled, cooled, infused with herbs, and carried in covered vessels. It arrived just before dawn, warm but not steaming, its scent of marjoram and thyme gently rising into the heavy air of the royal chambers. There were cloths, dozens of them, soft linen squares folded into precise stacks, each used only once before being discarded into a cedar box, which was itself cleaned daily. The cloths were not washed with soap and returned. No, they were laundered by a special servant assigned by the Chamberlain, who swore oaths of silence. They were steeped in vinegar, scalded in iron pots, and dried away from public view. Next came the oils: rose, myrrh, lavender. These were not simply for fragrance, but for function. They masked odours, softened cracking skin, and acted as invisible veils between Elizabeth's body and the world. A single vial of oil, if too strongly scented or wrongly chosen, could cause the Queen to retreat for days. The Chamberlain once replaced a supplier after the Queen fainted from a scent too heavy in neroli. Then there were the garments. The Queen's shifts, stockings and gowns were not merely cleaned, they were examined. The Chamberlain received written reports from the mistress of the robes: stains, odd discolorations, torn hems, strange textures. These notes were discreet, written in ciphered shorthand that only the inner circle could read. Some days the report was blank, others it was pages long. The Queen's underclothing in particular was a focus of scrutiny. Linen was believed to absorb impurities from the body. A clean shift each day was as essential as any prayer. But once worn, that shift became a diagnostic scroll, a story of the Queen's interior life told through scent, moisture, and shade. If it smelled faintly sour or bore signs of discharge, it was not merely washed. It was documented. Even her wigs, towering constructions of horsehair, human hair, silk, and powder, fell under the Chamberlain's domain. They were not merely arranged, they were curated. Each wig was cleaned with dry cloths, gently brushed with lavender or clove oil, and checked for signs of lice or decay. The Queen had dozens, but only a few were worn regularly, and only after careful preparation. To place an unclean wig upon her head would have been tantamount to treason. All of this was done in silence. Always. The Chamberlain did not speak directly to the Queen unless summoned. His work was woven into the rhythm of the day. Its success measured not in praise, but in peace, in the Queen's continued composure, her refusal to mention discomfort, her ability to endure the gaze of foreign ambassadors without flinching. Sometimes the Queen would dismiss her court early. On such days, the Chamberlain knew something had been missed. A note overlooked, a cloth that smelled faintly of lye, an oil too cold, too pungent. The margins for error were razor thin. He carried a bundle of scented gloves wherever he went, one pair for wearing, one for offering, one for emergencies. They were soaked in amber, stitched with gold thread, and lined in silk. If a sudden visitor arrived, he could press a glove into their hand, a subtle way to mask any unpleasant odour lingering in the corridor. Once, when the plague threatened the city's edge, the Chamberlain was responsible for clearing an entire wing of Whitehall. He ordered the rushes burned, the walls scrubbed with lime water, the furniture aired in the sun. Elizabeth never mentioned the change, but the next morning she wore a lighter gown, one suited to warmer, cleaner air. He took it as a nod of approval, but even the Chamberlain could not prevent time. As Elizabeth aged, her body changed. Her skin became thinner, less tolerant of powders. Her breath soured more quickly, her appetite waned. The soft ulcers on her legs, once rare, began to linger. The lead makeup, once her armour, now cracked and bled into the creases of her face. The Chamberlain adjusted. He commissioned new creams, worked with apothecaries to develop gentler salves. He requested silk inner linings on her gowns to reduce abrasion. The Queen never commented, but she allowed him to remain. There were moments, few and fleeting, when she let the mask slip. Once, during a late-night meeting after a storm had shaken the windows loose, she beckoned him closer. The room smelled faintly of mildew and wet stone. She asked, "Do you think I smell like a corpse, my lord?" The Chamberlain paused only a breath and then said, "No, your majesty. You smell like cedar and crown." She did not smile, but she did not send him away. He told no one of that exchange. He had served her long enough to know that every word carried weight, and every silence even more so. In the end, the Chamberlain's tasks would never be recorded in history books. He would not be remembered with statues or ballads. But his hands had held the unseen empire, the kingdom of cloth and oil and breath. The small, delicate world that allowed Elizabeth to be divine while remaining defiantly human. And when he finally stepped down from his post, aged, nearly blind and with fingers gnarled from years of precision, the Queen reportedly said only, "He kept the air clean." It was the highest praise she had ever offered, and so now, as the candlelight fades and the palace corridors grow quiet, imagine that figure moving in the shadows once more, gloved, silent, unseen. The scent of myrrh lingers faintly as he closes a chamber door. Another day has ended. The Queen will wake soon, and everything must be perfect again. But what truly could perfection mean in a world where no one dares to bathe? We shall step further into that contradiction next, to where cosmetics become shields, and every brushstroke is a battle against decay. Morning came not with sunlight, but with ceremony. Even before Elizabeth opened her eyes, the world around her had begun its slow transformation. The fire was already lit. The rushes already changed. Her linen shift, freshly warmed, lay folded on the edge of her bed. But the true ritual, the one that turned woman into monarch, had not yet begun. That ritual lived in a box, a simple one at first glance, polished oak with brass hinges, unassuming save for the scent that clung to it, vinegar, crushed roses, and something faintly metallic. Inside, the Queen's face waited to be painted into being. Elizabeth Tudor did not merely apply makeup, she armoured herself with it, and it began with white. The famed mask of youth, as some whispered, was no gentle powdering. It was a thick, cold paste known as ceruse, a lethal blend of white lead and vinegar that promised an alabaster complexion. Applied daily, it smoothed the skin, concealed pox scars, and reflected candlelight with ethereal perfection. But beneath its beauty lay poison. The Queen had once caught smallpox, a ravaging sickness that left many disfigured. She survived, but not unmarked. And in a court obsessed with appearances, the slightest imperfection could become a threat. So she painted over history, day after day, year after year. The application took hours. Her ladies-in-waiting, trained not just in manners but in chemistry, began by wiping her face with vinegar-soaked cloths. This, they believed, purified the skin. Then came a light dusting of ground bone or chalk, followed by the thick ceruse paste, applied with a flat brush made of squirrel fur. Each stroke was slow, deliberate, and heavy. Her face became a canvas. Once whitened, it was time for colour. Rouge, crushed cochineal beetles mixed with gum arabic and egg whites, was dabbed onto her cheeks in small, deliberate circles. A dab too low suggested sadness, too high, frivolity. The Queen favoured a balanced placement, regal and unreadable. Her lips, once naturally pale, were coloured with a paste of cinnabar, a form of mercury. It glistened faintly in the light, giving her smile a strange, otherworldly sheen. But it stung the tongue. She learned early to speak without letting it touch her teeth. Finally, her eyebrows, once thick, now thinned by time and product, they were redrawn each morning using soot mixed with elderberry juice. The arch had to be perfect, high enough to express disdain, soft enough to suggest grace. The Queen rarely looked in the mirror as it was done. She did not need to. Her face had become routine. By the time the painting ended, Elizabeth no longer resembled the woman who had risen from bed. She had become the monarch the world expected, pale, pristine, unchanging. But beneath the layers, her skin rebelled. The ceruse cracked as the day wore on. Tiny lines appeared, then widened. The paste dried the flesh, drawing it taut. Beneath the makeup, ulcers formed. Small fissures opened along her jawline, behind her ears, in the soft crease of her neck. Her physicians prescribed honey pastes, rose oil, even crushed pearls, but nothing reversed the toll. Still, the Queen refused to abandon her mask. Even in her private chambers, she wore it. Even among those she trusted, her face remained curated. For to remove the paint would be to reveal time, and time, to a ruler, was a dangerous truth. Some days, the makeup took longer. Her skin flaked, the sores wept, the lead stung freshly opened wounds. On those days, the Queen remained silent, still, enduring each stroke without complaint. Her ladies, loyal to the end, applied the paste with trembling precision. They knew what it cost her, but they also knew what it gave her. For in that mask lived a legend. Ambassadors who knelt before her saw a figure ageless and powerful. Courtiers who sought favour dared not comment on the unnatural pallor. And subjects who caught glimpses of her in procession saw only a sovereign untouched by the years that ravaged them. Can you imagine that burden? To be both woman and symbol, and to allow no space between the two. Elizabeth bore it with terrifying grace. On rare occasions, when she received intimates in private, she might appear without full regalia. But even then, some form of makeup adorned her skin. A faint white dust, a soft rouge to the cheeks. Only a select few saw her wholly barefaced. And those who did never spoke of it. The mask was not just for others, it was for herself. There are accounts, brief and whispered, of the Queen gazing at her reflection with a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. Some claimed she spoke to it. Others believed she refused to look too long. After all, the mirror told the truth, and truth was rarely a comfort. As the years passed, the rituals lengthened. The sores grew harder to hide. Her hands, once delicate and deft, trembled. Still, she painted. Still, she reigned. The lead slowly poisoned her, clouded her mind, thinned her hair, made her moods unpredictable. But she never stopped. To do so would be to surrender, and Elizabeth Tudor had never been one to surrender. Her final years were marked by increasing seclusion. She allowed fewer visitors, spoke less, appeared only under the perfect light of afternoon. When she emerged, fully adorned, silence followed her. Her courtiers no longer whispered of her beauty. They whispered of her resolve. For by then the makeup had become more than protection. It was defiance. It was rule. It was the last armour of a queen who had outlived her enemies, her suitors, her siblings, and perhaps even herself. Now, as the scent of powdered rose fades and the candles burn low, imagine her seated at her dressing table, eyes steady as the final layer is brushed across her cheek, the mask complete, the transformation finished. And yet, behind the perfection, a heartbeat, steady and mortal. We go next to the crown of it all, to her hair, her wigs, and the truth that never washed away. The crown never rested directly on her head. Though Elizabeth Tudor ruled with a force of will that shaped continents, the actual crown, heavy with rubies, pearls, and golden filigree, was rarely seen on her bare scalp. For under that symbol of power sat another artifact of equal significance. The wig. Not one, but many, dozens. Carefully arranged by colour, height and curl, her wigs formed a private archive of power, youth and deception. They were not just fashion statements or courtly accessories. They were shields, sentinels, replacements for what time and toxins had taken. And beneath them, a truth almost no one was permitted to witness. Elizabeth's real hair, once golden red, thick as a fox's tail, had thinned over the decades. The ceruse and mercury-laced tinctures applied to her skin had seeped into her roots. Her scalp became raw, dotted with sores, sensitive to touch and prone to infection. Eventually, even gentle brushing became an agony. So she stopped. Water, already feared in Elizabethan hygiene practice, was never used on her hair. Shampoo did not yet exist. Instead, the Queen adopted a system of dry cleansing, not with powders like talc, but with cloth, scented oils, and careful, limited friction. Her ladies-in-waiting were instructed to tend her hair no more than once every 10 days, and only then with the greatest care. The process began with lavender-infused linen warmed over coals. The cloth was dabbed gently against the scalp, absorbing sweat and surface oils, while the hair, what little remained, was lifted away from the skin to allow the pores to breathe. What remained of her natural hair was often braided tightly, then hidden under a padded silk cap. Over this, the chosen wig for the day was affixed, its placement a precise art, aligned with her brow, pinned at the temples, secured beneath the elaborate lacework of her headpieces. It had to appear natural, seamless, as if it grew from her very soul. Most of her wigs were made from imported human hair, often sourced from young women in Venice or the Netherlands. Others used dyed horsehair, prized for its ability to hold sculpted curls. Each piece was styled by a specialist, one of the few artisans granted regular private access to the Queen. He worked in silence, his tools kept in a black velvet roll embroidered with gold thread, combs, shears, beeswax, bone pins, and wire forms. One style in particular became her trademark, the Roman hair, curled into intricate coils and pinned high upon her head, topped with a pearl-encrusted crescent. It drew the eye upward, away from her aging face, and toward a visage of grandeur. To the people, it was a symbol of order, grace, and eternal youth. But the weight was considerable. Some wigs stretched nearly a foot in height. The Queen would wear them for hours, through meetings, ceremonies, audiences, despite the strain on her neck and the ache it placed upon her inflamed scalp. Sometimes, when the pain was too much, she would excuse herself, return to her private chambers, and remove the piece in silence. On those days, she often sat alone, her head wrapped in silk, eyes closed as her ladies massaged rose oil into the reddened skin beneath. No one spoke. The act was ritual, gentle, reverent, and always temporary. Because she would soon don another wig, the next mask in a collection of many. The wigs were cleaned with careful methods. No water touched them. Instead, they were brushed free of dust and residue, then smoked gently over pots of burning herbs. The process infused them with scent and helped ward off lice and other pests. For deeper cleaning, the hair was wiped with linen soaked in orange water and wine. Any wig that became too stiff or faded was disassembled and restructured, no piece wasted. The Queen's chambers included an entire closet for hair pieces, not just for storage, but for staging. Each morning, the options were laid out on cushioned stands, each labelled in Latin with a reference to its occasion. Aurum matutinum, golden morning. Civitas, for council. Tempestas, for stormy weather. And even funesta, for mourning. The Queen made her choice not just based on weather or ceremony, but on mood. Sometimes she wore auburn. Sometimes platinum. Once, during a period of grief, she wore a piece nearly black, a rare moment that sparked both fear and awe among her court. No one dared ask about her real hair. To do so would be to acknowledge mortality, but servants whispered. A dropped comb, a single strand found on a pillow, a faint red smear on the lining of a cap. All told stories. It was said her real hair grew brittle, breaking at the root, that she wept the first time a lock came away in her hand, that the very poison that preserved her face had taken her crown. And yet, she never stopped wearing the makeup, never stopped donning the wigs. In fact, she became more meticulous. Some believed the elaborate hairpieces offered her a kind of armour, a way to transcend the changes of age, to stay one step ahead of time itself. When foreign dignitaries visited, she selected her most commanding pieces. Sometimes adorned with ostrich feathers, sometimes braided with pearls, sometimes ringed with gold thread that glinted in torchlight. The symbolism was clear. Her rule was strong, unchanging, eternal. But what the world did not see was the cost. On many nights, the Queen retired with a migraine that pulsed behind her eyes. Her neck, already weakened by age, was sore from the constant strain of holding so much weight aloft. Some nights, her hands shook so badly that she had to be helped to undress. And when her scalp cracked open in small, bleeding wounds, her attendants would sit with her for hours, soothing her with whispered verses and cold cloths soaked in chamomile. And still, she refused to be seen bare. It was not vanity, not entirely. It was power. For a queen, to be seen as weakening was to invite vultures. And Elizabeth had seen what happened to queens who faltered. Mary, her half-sister, reduced to whispers and rumour before her death. Anne Boleyn, her own mother, accused and executed within weeks. Weakness in their world was not mourned, it was devoured. So Elizabeth hid her pain beneath curls and gold and scent, and in doing so, she became legend. Visitors to her court wrote of her majesty with awe. One Spanish ambassador described her as a goddess crowned with sunbeams. Another, from the German states, noted that her hair seemed spun from celestial thread. None knew they were speaking of wigs, of clever artifice stitched over the vulnerable remains of a very human woman. Even as her eyesight dimmed and her body thinned, she kept the same regal silhouette. The same cascade of red or gold, the same upward reach of crown-like curls. And in doing so, she convinced even herself. It is said that near the end, she refused to sleep in bed, instead resting upright in a chair, afraid that if she laid her head down, she might not rise again. Her wig remained in place, her face still painted, the illusion unbroken. Her final days were veiled in silence. Only her most trusted attendants saw her then. And they never described what they saw, what state her hair was in, whether she removed her wig, whether her scalp, so long tormented by paint and pressure, finally gave way. What we know is this. When she died, her head was wrapped in silk, her body laid out in state beneath a golden canopy, and her wig, the one chosen for eternity, was a soft auburn, curled and brightened with powdered gold. She had outlived her enemies, her rivals, and her age. She had, in many ways, outlived herself. Now, as night deepens, and you imagine her reflection in the candlelit mirror, a crown of coils, eyes heavy with time, consider the hands that placed those wigs, the fingers that combed each strand. The quiet sorrow of dressing someone not just in beauty, but in defiance. We've seen her face and her hair, the outward symbols. Next we step inward, to the garments that shielded her most intimate self, to the linen rituals that replaced the bath, and the belief that purity could be worn. It is perhaps the strangest contradiction of Elizabeth's court, a realm of silk and pearl, rosewater and reverence, without soap, not entirely, for soap existed in her time, but in her chambers and across the royal court, it was largely shunned. Not for lack of luxury, but for something far more powerful, fear. To us, cleanliness means water, steam, suds. But in the 16th century, water was not trusted. It was a gateway for illness, a solvent for disease. The body, it was believed, was made porous by heat. Bathe too often, and your very skin would open, letting in the damp humours thought to cause plague, fever, even madness. Soap, then, was a rarity. It was coarse, foul-smelling, made from animal fat and lye, more often used to scrub laundry or floors than skin. And Elizabeth, ever conscious of appearance and danger, avoided it altogether. So how, you might ask, did a court of hundreds maintain hygiene? They didn't. Not in the modern sense. But they had their methods. The illusion of cleanliness was preserved through ritual, scent, and cloth. Linen, not water, was the answer to impurity. Linen shifts, linen ruffs, linen stockings, linen sheets. Elizabeth wore it in layers, touched it constantly, changed it daily. Each piece absorbed oils, sweat, and odour, drawing them away from the body like a sponge of woven virtue. And the moment that linen left her body, it was no longer a garment. It became evidence. Servants were trained to read it. A faint yellowing at the collar. Normal. A darkened underarm. Perhaps a sign of stress. A brownish stain along the thighs. Noted discreetly. Recorded. The Queen's health was monitored not through examination but through laundry. Behind the scenes, her linen was washed not with soap, but with boiling water and ash, sometimes vinegar, sometimes rosemary or thyme. The process took days. It was scalding work, and the laundresses who did it were rarely seen, kept to the edges of the palace, their labour folded into silence. Yet they held more knowledge of the Queen's body than most of her council. Linen was also used to wash without water. Each morning, the Queen was dabbed from head to toe with cloths soaked in fragrant vinegar, not rubbed, dabbed. The motion was gentle, pressing scent and antiseptic into the skin while lifting away the residue of the day before. This act, performed by trusted attendants, replaced the bath. Her limbs were wiped, her underarms padded dry, her feet, wrapped in fine wool overnight to maintain warmth, were aired briefly, then rewrapped. The ritual was soothing, controlled, free from the unpredictability of splashing water or sudden chills. Once cleaned, her body was dusted with powders, crushed iris root, starch, orris, soft, fragrant, absorbent. The powders clung to the skin, masking sheen and scent. They created a tactile barrier, protecting the Queen's flesh from the irritants of fabric and time. And still, despite these efforts, her skin bore the truth. Dry patches, cracks, itchiness. The sores behind her knees and under her arms grew with the years. They were never spoken of directly, only ever referred to as sensitive places. To bathe, to submerge her body in water, was an event of rare and serious intention. Records suggest she bathed perhaps once a month. Some say even less. When she did, it was a production. A copper tub was brought to her private chambers. The water boiled, cooled, and perfumed with herbs. The room closed to all but her most trusted women. The Queen would step in slowly, wary always, and sit upright, her arms never fully submerged. The soak lasted no more than 15 minutes, any longer, and she feared illness. Then came drying, with heated cloths, thick and absorbing. Her body was powdered before the last of the moisture had even vanished. She once said, reportedly, "I bathe only when necessary, and never with pleasure." And so the court followed her lead. Courtiers mimicked her rituals. They too used dry cloths, scented gloves, and vinegar wipes. They wore perfumed pouches in their sleeves, changed linen obsessively, washed their hands with spiced wine or diluted spirits. Some, desperate for cleanliness, turned to strange powders, including ground eggshell or powdered toadstone. But for most, water remained a last resort. The Queen's chambers were, in fact, almost entirely without running water. Pitchers were carried in and out, heated over coals. Bowls were used, emptied, and replaced. The floor beneath her washstand was strewn with fresh rushes each day to absorb spills. The stand itself, carved from cedar and inlaid with mother of pearl, never saw a splash. There were no sinks, no soap bars, only scent and cloth. Perfume then became vital, not just to please the Queen, but to survive proximity to others. Rose water was most common, distilled in palace kitchens and mixed with orange peel or bay. Lavender came next, prized for its sharp clarity. The wealthiest wore ambergris, a waxy secretion from the belly of a whale, which aged into a scent so soft and musky it was said to drive memory from the mind. The Queen's signature scent was said to be a mix of roses, musk, and damask water. Her gloves were soaked in it. Her letters carried its trace. Her presence lingered in the air long after she had gone. But not all was sweet. Underneath the perfume, the stench of the court remained. The bodies of dozens pressed together in the antechambers. The privies rarely emptied. The dogs allowed to roam freely, their droppings scattered among the rushes. The mould that crept into stone walls. The rot of flowers left too long in vases. And the breath, rich, unbrushed, often tainted with rot. It was said that you could tell a nobleman's wealth not by his clothing, but by his scent and his distance. For those allowed close to the Queen, hygiene became a currency. You washed not to be clean, but to be allowed near power. And the Queen, Elizabeth, maintained her distance with expert care. She touched few, embraced none. Her meals were served on sterilized silver. Her goblet never shared. If someone sneezed in her presence, they were quietly removed, sometimes banned for weeks. Her chambers were fumigated regularly with juniper smoke. Carpet were beaten with lavender branches. In winter, the air was thick with the scent of pine and candle wax. In summer, it smelled of vinegar and anxiety, all to maintain the illusion, for that was what the court without soap ultimately was. An illusion, a performance of purity, a dance of linen and powder, scent and silence. The Queen was the lead dancer, her every movement rehearsed, her every breath controlled. But even she could not escape the toll. As the years wore on, the rashes worsened. Her skin peeled at the wrists. Her underarms blistered. The vinegar burns left marks. And yet, still she resisted the bath. Still she chose cloth over water. Still she performed cleanliness rather than embrace it. Her body was sacred, symbolic. It could not be seen to bleed, to sweat, to itch. And so the mask continued. The scent thickened. The linen piled higher. Even in death she avoided exposure. When her body was prepared for burial, her ladies washed her not with soap, but with white wine and rose water. Her final shift of the softest linen, embroidered with gold thread, was drawn over her skin like a shroud of ritual. Her hands were gloved, her hairpiece chosen, her face lightly powdered. There was no soap. There never had been. And in that absence, in that carefully curated void, a legend was preserved. Now, close your eyes and imagine walking through the palace. The stone is cold beneath your feet. The air smells of roses and something else, something buried. You pass chambermaids bearing baskets of linen, their hands red from vinegar and labour. You catch a glimpse of a dressing table, powders, cloths, scented bottles, but never a bar of soap. And in the distance, you hear her voice, measured, calm, wrapped in the illusion she herself had created. Next, we enter the heart of that illusion, the linen rituals. They called it the art of dressing, but to Elizabeth I and her closest attendants, it was a sacred rite, a daily reconstruction of power using nothing more than fabric, scent, and silence. Long before the Queen ever emerged into the public light of court, a quiet flurry of movement would stir behind the carved oak doors of her bedchamber. There, in a room warmed by flickering firelight and perfumed with bay leaves and beeswax, her linen rituals would begin. And with them, a process more intimate and revealing than any royal audience. In Elizabethan England, linen was more than fabric. It was protection, cleansing, status, health. It touched the body directly, the only material allowed to rest against the skin of the Queen. Where water was suspect and soap abrasive, linen absorbed. It drew out sweat, odour, and impurity. And so the shift, that simple undergarment worn closest to the flesh, became an instrument of both hygiene and surveillance. The Queen owned hundreds, each one made of the finest flax, hand-woven and bleached in the summer sun until it shone white as bone. Some were plain, others adorned with delicate embroidery, symbols of Tudor roses, entwined initials, or protective charms stitched in golden thread. Each was pressed, scented, and folded with reverence. Each morning, one would be selected, but not at random. The mistress of the robes, in consultation with the chamber ladies and, on certain days, the physician, would choose a shift appropriate to the Queen's condition. If her skin was inflamed, they might opt for a looser weave. If she suffered from chills, a heavier one, lined with silk thread along the collar. On ceremonial days, the linen would be trimmed in lace, soaked in damask water, and lightly dusted with orris root powder. But even before the shift was laid upon the warming stand, another ritual took place. The examination of the linens worn the day before. It was a silent, clinical process. The discarded shift, no longer a garment, now a document, was unfurled upon a long table in a separate chamber. Gloved attendants would inspect every inch. They looked for stains, discoloration, unusual scent. Each mark told a story, an edge darkened with sweat, a smudge of rouge on the sleeve, a faint iron hue near the thighs. These were not just bodily signs. They were political indicators. Had the Queen slept soundly? Had she bled? Had she perspired more than usual? Everything was noted, quietly, respectfully, but precisely. The information was then carried, delicately, to the Lord Chamberlain, and if needed, to the physician. No comment would be made unless absolutely necessary. But if something were amiss, changes would be implemented immediately. A different powder, a revised dressing schedule, the inclusion of a soothing balm in the next morning's regimen. Back in the Queen's chamber, the ritual continued. Her body was cleansed, not with water, but with linen. Warm cloths soaked in wine vinegar and rose water. Her arms were pressed gently, her neck dabbed. Her legs, examined only when needed, were often left untouched, unless signs of rash or swelling appeared. Then came the new shift. Warmed by the fire, aired, and folded in a very specific way so that when unfolded before her, it draped like a curtain of purity. The Queen would raise her arms, and her attendants would ease the garment over her head in a single practiced motion. Can you imagine that moment? The flicker of firelight against the sheen of white cloth, the hush of movement, the Queen's body, aging, guarded, regal, cloaked once more in silence. Once the shift was in place, the next layers followed. A pair of fine linen stockings, tied with ribbons just below the knee, a set of stiffened petticoats, depending on the weather, and then the outer garments, corsets, gowns, ruffs, oversleeves, each added with the same precision as the shift. But it was the linen closest to her skin that mattered most. She often requested that her sleeves remain loose, preferring the air to pass through. Her collars, while ornate in public, were lined with soft bands of underlinen to protect her neck from chafing. On colder days, wool was layered discreetly beneath the linen, though never allowed to touch her skin directly. It was said she could detect the difference even blindfolded. The chamber was designed around these rituals. A wardrobe wall held rows of freshly pressed shifts, arranged not by appearance, but by texture and purpose. Another closet held retired pieces, some worn, some carefully repaired, all catalogued and preserved. The Queen, it was known, sometimes asked to see her old linens, as if remembering chapters of her life through cloth. But even more curious was how these linens were treated after use. They were never discarded without care. After examination, each shift was hand-washed in boiling water, then laid out under the open sky to dry. On clear days, the palace gardens shimmered with pale linen spread across hedges and drying lines. On wet days, they were suspended from the beams of attics, the scent of vinegar and rosemary drifting through the rafters. To bleach the fabric, lemon juice or urine might be used, a practice both common and unpleasant, but effective. Afterward, the garments were rinsed again, beaten with paddles, and finally ironed with stones heated over flame. The result, soft, gleaming cloth, scented faintly of citrus and smoke. When returned to the Queen's chamber, they were folded into origami-like rectangles and stored between sachets of lavender and crushed clove. The Queen never handled them herself, but she always noticed if something was wrong. If a shift was too stiff, she would lift a brow. If the linen scratched her neck, she would purse her lips. Once, it is said, she refused an audience for an entire day because her sleeves had been scented with the wrong flower. The linens were not simply comfort. They were her second skin, pure, layered, protective, and as such they became her most constant companions. Unlike courtiers, they never betrayed her. Unlike ministers, they kept silent. Unlike mirrors, they did not judge. they simply absorbed. And in that absorption, they gave her control. But perhaps the most telling part of the linen ritual came not from the fabric itself, but from what it replaced. A bath. For every day she dressed in fresh linen, Elizabeth reaffirmed her rejection of water. For every cloth wiped across her skin, she declared her body off-limits to the dangers of heat, damp, and exposure. And for every shift changed, she told the world, "I am pure, not because I am washed, but because I am untouched." The symbolism was not lost on her, nor on those around her. In a time when spiritual cleanliness was tied to bodily purity, the Queen's daily ritual became a statement of divinity. She, the Virgin Queen, the untouchable, became one with her linens, white, folded, unmarred, even as her health declined, even as sores formed, even as the cloth had to be changed more frequently, as attendants quietly adjusted the rituals to accommodate her aging body. Still, she insisted. Still, the linens came. Even in her final months, when she took fewer audiences and remained often in bed, her shifts were changed. Her body was wiped, her skin powdered. When she refused food, she did not refuse her linen. It was said that after her death, her final shift was not burned, but kept, folded, sealed, preserved, a relic, as if the fabric itself held some trace of the woman who had ruled for so long, without once showing the world her naked truth. And now, in the quiet of night, picture that linen, pale as moonlight, soft as whispered vows, drifting gently in a sunlit garden, hanging from a line stretched between palace oaks. No sound, no wind, just the breath of fabric, remembering the weight of a queen. Next, we pass from cloth to cure, from linen to potion, to the strange world of elixirs and oils, concocted not to heal but to protect, and to uphold the myth of purity that defined her reign. She trusted few, and among them, perhaps least of all, her physicians. They came to her cloaked in learning and Latin, carried their knowledge in leather-bound volumes and glass phials, whispered of humours and balances, of spleens and stars. And yet to Elizabeth, their knowledge, though vast, always brushed too close to vulnerability. Still, she could not ignore them entirely. Her body, like her realm, needed tending, and so she allowed them into her world, carefully, cautiously, with rules. Her physicians were granted limited access to her chambers, only when summoned, and only under specific pretense. They were to observe more than touch, suggest more than declare. Their prescriptions passed through layers of trusted hands before reaching her. Yet they were always watching. Not the Queen's face, which remained perfectly masked behind powder and paint, but the edges, the hands, the voice, the colour of her lips, the warmth of her breath, the texture of her hairline beneath the wig. From these subtle signs, they built their diagnoses. And what a strange field of medicine it was. Elizabethan healing danced somewhere between science and superstition. A physician might consult the stars before preparing a draft. Another might recommend crushed emerald as a cure for fever. Diagnosis was based on the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was not a symptom of germs, but of imbalance. Too much heat, too little moisture, an overactive liver, a melancholic disposition. And to treat such imbalances, the Queen's body was introduced to an extraordinary array of potions, powders, tinctures, and elixirs, each more peculiar than the last. She consumed pearls, ground to fine dust, believed to bring clarity and strengthen the heart. She sipped wine steeped with gold leaf, thought to prolong youth and elevate spirit. To settle the stomach, she was given syrup of violets. For melancholy, distilled valerian and rosemary. There were tonics made from crushed coral, milk of poppies, and powdered unicorn horn. The latter not truly unicorn, but the long spiral tusk of a narwhal, prized by apothecaries and sold for more than its weight in silver. Physicians brewed oils to be massaged into her skin: camphor, rosehip, myrrh, and civet. These were applied to soothe ulcers beneath the makeup, to calm the swelling that often flared around her joints. On her worst days, she allowed only a few drops, dabbed onto warm cloth, to press gently against the affected areas. But she never allowed these oils to linger long. Anything that softened the skin, made it more porous, felt dangerous. Her body was not to be exposed, even to medicine. And so, the Queen often washed these salves off quickly, replacing them with powder, with paint, with performance. For when a woman ruled alone, even illness was a threat to power. It wasn't only physicians who attended to her health. The Queen also relied on her herbalists, quiet, older women who spoke in whispers and carried pouches of dried plants wrapped in muslin. These women were the keepers of older knowledge. Folk cures, inherited recipes, secrets passed through generations. They prepared poultices for her sores using comfrey and marigold, mixed elderflower and sage into cooling balms, brewed teas of chamomile and licorice root for the long nights when sleep would not come. One herbalist, known in the palace only as Mistress Anne, was said to prepare a special tincture just for the Queen, using crushed violets and raw honey steeped in warmed milk. Elizabeth took it only when her breath grew laboured, or when sorrow pressed too tightly against her ribs. But no matter the source, physician or wise woman, every potion was filtered through layers of caution, each ingredient inspected, each process observed. Elizabeth kept strict records of what she ingested and what she applied. If a rash flared or a sore grew worse, the offending mixture was never used again. If a tonic left her dizzy, it was banished. If it soothed her, she kept it, but changed the method, the dose, the timing. For in her heart, Elizabeth remained her own most trusted physician. She understood her body's language, knew which scents stirred her nausea, knew which oils numbed pain without dulling the mind. She charted her own rhythms, tracking her appetite, her sleep, her cycles. Still, there were times when illness forced her hand. When a fever came, sudden, sharp, she would retreat behind her canopied bed, the hangings drawn, the chamber dimmed. Only her most trusted attendants entered. The fire would be stoked, the air thick with juniper smoke, and beneath the blankets, she would sweat out the sickness. Physicians brought mixtures of dried fig and vinegar. They placed warmed bricks at her feet, dabbed her forehead with cloths dipped in lily water. A bowl of sliced apple might be left at her bedside, not to eat, but to scent the air. Once, when her temperature soared, a physician proposed bloodletting. The Queen refused. She would not be pierced, not even for health. Instead, she permitted a cooling syrup, lemon and barley water, laced with a touch of brandy. It brought her fever down, and the physician never suggested blades again. For external ailments, especially the painful ulcers caused by years of lead-based makeup, the treatments were even more cautious. Ointments were prepared using white beeswax, almond oil, and a touch of powdered pearl. Applied at night, then gently wiped away before the morning mask. Sometimes, a poultice of mashed fig and cream was laid across her jaw. Once it was discovered that rosehip oil calmed the worst of her flare-ups, it became her nightly routine. Applied in secret, then hidden beneath the final layers of her performance. Perhaps the most extraordinary potion used was not for healing, but for breath. As the queen aged, her teeth darkened, loosened, her gums receded, sometimes bled. To mask the resulting odor, her herbalist created a breath elixir made of aniseed, cardamom, clove, and powdered mint leaves, sweetened with syrup and taken in pearl-sized drops. It gave her breath the faint scent of licorice and kept the illusion of freshness intact during audiences. But even the finest potions could not halt time. Her joints grew stiff, her eyesight faded, her digestion slowed. The once occasional tinctures became daily necessities: a drop to sleep, a syrup to rise, an oil for swelling, a powder for clarity. And yet, despite it all, she refused the one act that might have offered comfort: rest. Illness, she believed, was a choice, and the will of a queen could overcome almost anything. Perhaps that is why her healers, both scientific and spiritual, never addressed her ailments directly. They treated symptoms, not causes, dosed gently, whispered reassurance, never dared speak the truth aloud, that beneath the rouge and lace and perfumed breath, her body was quietly unraveling. But still she stood, still she reigned, still she summoned ambassadors with a steady hand and a voice clear as ever. Behind her, always, were the scents of dried herbs, the gleam of glass bottles, the flutter of prescriptions penned in careful Latin. And in her dressing room, behind the veil of oils and cloths, her physician's journal remained open, pages filled with coded notes and quiet hope. Now, as the candle burns low and the fire crackles with rosewood and sage, imagine her seated beneath her velvet canopy, a tonic in hand, her breath shallow but measured. Outside, the moon hangs over the palace like a watchful eye, and inside, the queen takes one last sip. The potion settles, and the illusion continues. Next, we uncover the greatest irony of all, that the one substance meant to cleanse was feared above all others. It is difficult to imagine a world where water was not the essence of cleanliness, but the threat of decay. And yet, within the great palaces of Elizabethan England, among marble floors and gilded tapestries, perfumed gloves and pristine linens, water was not a tool of refreshment, but a whisper of danger. To Queen Elizabeth I, water did not purify, it endangered. She had been taught this from childhood. Her tutors, her physicians, even her nursemaids had reinforced the belief that warm water opened the pores, and with the pores, the gates to illness. Fevers, agues, the dreaded sweating sickness. They all entered, it was thought, when the skin was exposed to damp air and rising steam. And so, the Queen of England bathed rarely, cautiously, and with profound suspicion. Even as fountains glittered in palace courtyards, and ships crossed oceans guided by her hand, Elizabeth approached water as if it were fire, dangerous, beautiful, and always to be handled at a distance. She preferred to be cleansed by cloth, by linen, by rose oil and vinegar, but not water. Only a few times a year, sometimes only once per season, did she submit to a full bath. And even then, the process was one of carefully choreographed ritual, surrounded by fear and precision. When a bath was ordered, it began days in advance. A copper tub was removed from its long sleep in the stores. Carried by gloved hands, it was placed near the hearth in her private chamber, its base lined with soft cloth to prevent chill from rising through the metal. Great brass kettles of water were heated over open fires, then mixed with herbs, marjoram, chamomile, mint, and slowly cooled in clay jugs. The room was sealed, the floor covered with rushes, the air thick with incense and burning rosemary to drive out any lurking miasma. Attendants laid fresh linen across the furniture and draped silks across the walls to absorb moisture. Mirrors were covered, curtains closed, no draughts allowed, and when the Queen entered, the room fell into reverent silence. She would step slowly into the shallow bath, no deeper than her hips, wearing a thin shift even in the water, her body never fully submerged. She sat upright, shoulders tense, arms close to her sides. The water was warm, not hot, just enough to soften the air, never enough to open the skin. The process lasted no more than 15 minutes. During that time, her ladies would pour small pitchers of the scented water over her shoulders and arms, gently sponge her back and legs with linen cloths. No soap, only oil, only movement. Then came the drying. A fresh team of attendants stepped forward, silent, swift, to lift her from the bath and wrap her in layers of pre-warmed linen. Her feet were dried first, then her limbs, then her torso. The shift was removed, replaced immediately with another. Her body powdered. Her hair, or rather her scalp beneath the wig, blotted gently with cloths dabbed in lavender oil. The tub was emptied at once. The water disposed of far from her quarters, lest it attract disease. The cloths boiled, the rushes burned, the room fumigated with sulphur and sweet flag. And for days afterward, Elizabeth would remain stiller than usual, quiet, watchful, as if she feared the water's memory might cling to her skin. This was not eccentricity, it was survival. For the court knew, all too well, what followed reckless bathing. A chambermaid once collapsed after a bath on a cold day, struck with fever, dead within 3. A noblewoman's child perished after bathing too soon after childbirth. Tales of death by chill or vapours were whispered constantly. Even among the healthiest, a bath gone wrong was believed to unbalance the body's humours. And if it could happen to them, it could happen to a queen. Elizabeth had lived through plague, watched whole villages wiped out. She had seen disease spread through contact, through proximity, through touch. And in her world, water was an accomplice to these invisible killers. Better then to avoid it. Instead, she built a world where water existed only in controlled amounts, in goblets, in tinctures, in steam rising from a teacup, never rushing, never falling, never touching her fully. Even her fountains were built for sound, not use. The Queen loved the music of water, the trickle of it, the echo across stone. Gardens at Hampton Court and Nonsuch Palace featured elaborate fountains, their channels carved with faces and flowers, the water dyed blue with copper and flavoured with citrus for ceremonial display. But these were not for bathing, not even for washing. No, true washing belonged to the lower ranks, those who scrubbed floors, cleaned pots, or toiled in the laundry yards. They used water the way fire uses wood, with violence and necessity. The Queen never lowered herself to that element. Instead, she rose above it, in layers of linen, layers of lace, and layers of ritual. The concept of immersion was foreign to her body. Her skin had never touched a stream. Her limbs had never floated in a lake. Even the rain, that gentle baptism from above, was something to be avoided. When clouds darkened and storms approached, she remained indoors. Her walks in the gardens were cancelled, her horses stabled. If caught in a drizzle, she covered herself entirely, gloves on, face turned away. She loathed the feeling of dampness on her sleeves, the weight of water in her skirts. Even tears, it was said, unsettled her. She once turned away from a weeping courtier and said, "Spare me your floods. I am not built for drowning." It was a jest, but a revealing one. In Elizabeth's world, water was the great unraveller of composure, of illusion, of control. It made things soft that were meant to stay firm. It revealed the shape beneath the costume. It rusted what was meant to shine. And so, the Queen remained dry. Through summers of fever, through winters of frost, through youth and age, her body wrapped in powder and fabric, her breath scented with spice, her scalp cleaned with cloth. No splash, no soak, no immersion. And yet, water surrounded her. The Thames flowed beside her palaces, wide and slow, carrying barges of wine and barrels of vinegar. Rain pattered against stained glass windows. Herbal waters simmered in apothecaries' pans. Fountains danced just outside her reach, but it never touched her. She watched it, listened to it, directed it, but she never let it close. Because beneath all the performance, the gowns, the wigs, the paint, she knew this truth. Water would not respect her crown. It would wash away the powders, soften the masks, reveal the woman beneath the sovereign. And that, more than illness, more than fever, more than chill, that was what she feared most. Now, in the hush of midnight, picture her seated near the hearth, a goblet of warmed posset in her hand. A single pitcher of water rests nearby, untouched. The fire cracks, the curtains draw tight. And outside, the rain falls soft and steady against the leaded glass. But she does not rise to meet it. Instead, she remains wrapped in dry linen, scented with herbs, wrapped in sovereignty. Next, we enter the world of scents that clung no matter how hard she tried to dispel them. The smell she could not escape, and those she chose to wear as armor. It was the scent that defined her. Not her crown, not her voice, not even the pages of her decrees. No. What lingered most vividly in the minds of those who entered Queen Elizabeth's presence was her scent. Not a single smell, but a layered orchestration of fragrance and flesh, powder and personhood. One that changed subtly over the years, but always clung like a second skin. To encounter the Queen was to breathe in her history. And yet, beneath the surface of choice and ceremony, there were smells Elizabeth could never fully command. They clung to her silks, wove themselves into the hem of her petticoats, and whispered from the folds of her linen like ghosts. They were the smells of the age, of the court, of the body, of death kept carefully at bay. The palace, even at its most pristine, was a breathing, sweating, rotting organism. Beneath the glitter of candlelight and pearl, life fermented, food spoiled, fires smoked, chamber pots filled and were emptied too slowly. Mould grew in the stone crevices. Dogs, beloved and untamed, left their own perfumes along the rush-covered floors. Elizabeth's own rooms were kept far cleaner than the rest. But even there, time and the body could not be masked entirely. There was, first and always, the scent of the paint, that thick paste of ceruse, white lead and vinegar, applied every morning to her face and neck. It carried a sharp metallic tang, softened only by the rose water in which her cloths were steeped. When warmed by the firelight or the press of her collar, it released a distinct odour, a mingling of sourness and something faintly floral, faintly chemical. It clung to her skin through the day, seeped into her ruffs, touched the tips of her gloves, and when the makeup was removed each night, delicately, with cloths and oils, the scent remained, embedded in the very pores of the room. Then there was her breath. Never foul, not in the open sense, but never sweet either. The years of potions, elixirs, breath pearls made of clove and cardamom, honey and anise, they left a residue of spice, a warmth, sometimes sharp, sometimes syrupy, always calculated. It was known that she avoided strong cheeses, onions, or meats in the morning. She often chewed fennel seeds or mint leaves before an audience. When she drank wine, she favoured those scented with herbs, rosemary, sage, or orange peel. Yet beneath all that preparation, her breath still bore the mark of time, of age, of the slow loosening of teeth and the dryness of the mouth caused by her powders. It smelled, some said, like memory, like something once sweet that had grown distant. Her clothing too had its own perfume. The outer garments, stiff gowns, pearl-laced bodices, heavy velvets, were not washed in water but brushed, beaten, and infused with scent. Lavender sachets were sewn into the seams. Gloves were steeped in rose oil and ambergris. Underskirts were dusted with iris root. She wore ribbons dipped in orange blossom water. On ceremonial days, she might pin a nosegay to her sleeve, a cluster of herbs and flowers chosen by her apothecary. But underneath lay something less delicate. The linen that touched her directly absorbed everything, from her sweat to the vinegar rubs, to the residue of balms and salves applied to her skin. And while those shifts were changed daily, the scent they collected did not vanish immediately. It lingered in the space between clothing layers, warmed by the body, released with every motion. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was human. And human was not something a monarch was meant to smell like. So Elizabeth built her arsenal of scents, not just perfume, but presence. She surrounded herself with fragrance. Her rooms were lined with sachets. Her books were bound in scented leather. The candles burned with frankincense and myrrh. The ink she used for personal letters was often perfumed. Even her pets, her lapdogs, wore collars lined with dried herbs. At court, it was said you could tell if the Queen had entered a room hours before by the smell alone. But there were other smells too, ones she could not choose. The smell of illness. On certain mornings, especially in the final years, her attendants noticed a sharpness in the air, a smell not entirely masked by rose or musk, the scent of inflamed skin, of bandaged sores, of decay barely held at bay. They never spoke of it, but they noticed, and they doubled the scenting of her garments on those days. When she suffered from toothaches, a sickly sweet smell would cling to her breath, made worse by the honey-soaked clove oil used to numb the pain. On days when her ulcers bled, the scent of iron would rise faintly, quickly met with layers of civet and camphor. She never acknowledged these things, never asked if the room smelled pleasant, never wondered aloud whether her presence had changed. But the servants noticed, the courtiers noticed, the dogs, perhaps, noticed most of all. And still she persisted. Still, she wore her perfumes like armour. Her signature scent evolved over time. In her youth, she favoured roses, damask rosewater, to be specific, delicate but pure. In her middle years, she grew fond of a blend of lavender, orange peel and clove, a bolder combination that conveyed clarity and strength. By her final decade, her fragrance became something deeper. Ambergris, musk, frankincense. These were scents not of maidenhood, but of myth. Heavier, more intoxicating, less about seduction, more about reverence. One ambassador from France once wrote, "To meet her grace is to breathe the sacred air of a cathedral, dark, sweet, and ageless." But what he did not write, what no one ever wrote, was that beneath that sacred air was something unmistakable. Mortality, the truth of a body alive too long in its own legend. And Elizabeth knew it. Which is why, over time, she grew more exacting with her scent rituals. She required her gloves to be refreshed daily. Her shifts burned rather than re-washed if they bore too much odour. She rejected spices she once loved if they reminded her of anything too earthy. She once demanded the removal of a new lady-in-waiting simply because the girl had worn too much patchouli, a scent Elizabeth claimed reminded her of rotting leaves. Even her sleep was scented. Before bed, her pillows were misted with rose water. A sachet of crushed violet and clove was tucked near her chest. The fire burned with applewood soaked in sweet wine. And as she drifted into sleep, the Queen inhaled not peace, perhaps, but control. For scent was control. It was presence. It was distance. It was the final barrier between her and the world that might, if it came too close, see her fully. And yet, despite her efforts, she could never control what the world itself smelled like. London was a stinking, steaming, fermenting city. Even in winter, the stench rose, from the river, from the sewers, from the press of thousands of unwashed bodies. When she rode in her litter through the city, she often pressed perfumed gloves to her face. Courtiers riding nearby did the same. Inside the palace, the air was filtered, as best it could be, with rushes and herbs. But it still crept in. The smell of the city was its own presence. And in moments of silence, moments when no courtier spoke, when no musician played, when the candles burned low, Elizabeth may have smelled it too. The truth, beneath the damask and velvet, beneath the rose and ambergris, beneath it all, the truth of the world she ruled, imperfect, decaying, alive. And perhaps, in her most private thoughts, she understood that this too was her legacy. Not the illusion of perfection, but the tension between scent and stink, between the myth she created and the body she inhabited. She once said, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." And perhaps that is what her scent was in the end. The perfume of a kingly heart held inside a body that fought day after day to remain divine. Now, as the air grows still and the night deepens, imagine walking past her chamber door. The corridor is silent. The floor is swept clean. And from behind the heavy oak door, a faint scent escapes. Something like rose, like wine, like something else you can't quite name. You stop, you breathe, and for a moment, you are in her presence. Next, we descend into the mouth of power, where tinctures met teeth, and where the Queen's breath was sweetened not by health, but by necessity. Her smile was a thing of myth, white, poised, elusive, seen only at calculated moments, a gentle upward curl, never too wide, a controlled expression of favour, never abandon, and always, it was said, sweetened with something rare, something fragrant, something carefully kept from spoiling. But in truth, Elizabeth's smile was an architecture of effort, a monument to control, and beneath it, pain. In her youth, she had possessed fine teeth. Accounts describe her as striking, even beautiful, with reddish gold hair, lively eyes, and a smooth, balanced face. But time, diet, and the relentless medical practices of the 16th century took their toll. Tooth care, in Elizabeth's day, was both rudimentary and perilous. Sugar had only recently become a staple among the elite, and the Queen, like most of her court, indulged in sweetmeats, candied fruits, and sugared wines. These pleasures, once rare and exotic, became daily indulgences at her table. Each bite a luxury, each sip a quiet erosion. By the time she reached middle age, her dental troubles had begun in earnest. First, it was a loosening tooth, then a darkening gum, then a dull, persistent ache along the right side of her jaw, the sort that never quite went away, even after the application of poultices and tinctures. But she said nothing. She allowed no complaint. Instead, she began to rely more heavily on tinctures. Clove oil was her first defense, a pungent, numbing essence pressed into a small scrap of cloth and tucked along the gum line. It dulled the ache, but introduced a new scent to her breath, sharp, spicy, almost medicinal. When clove failed, she turned to honey, not eaten, but applied. Raw honey was thought to draw out poison and reduce swelling. A favoured treatment involved mixing honey with powdered cinnamon and packing it lightly between the cheek and gum. It soothed the inflammation, temporarily, but the sweetness fed the decay it was meant to soothe. Her physicians, careful as ever, suggested rinsing with wine vinegar, believing its acidity would cleanse the mouth. And so she did, once a day, swishing the liquid gently before spitting into a lace-covered bowl held by her silent attendants. But vinegar too was no salvation. It weakened the enamel, and the slow rot continued. In public, her smile became increasingly rare. Her lips, once pink and lively, were painted in darker hues, cinnabar reds and berry tones, which distracted from the mouth beneath. She often placed her hand near her face when laughing. She spoke through her teeth. She whispered when she could have sung. And all the while, her tinctures grew more elaborate. By her later years, her apothecary prepared a daily lozenge made of powdered fennel, myrrh, mint, and sugar, meant to freshen the breath and ease pain. The Queen kept them in a small ivory box beside her bed. Visitors sometimes caught a whiff of them, a complex aroma not unlike incense, sweet but dark at its edges. Evenings were the hardest. The ache deepened with fatigue. The gums swelled after long days of speaking and smiling. And so, her nightstand became a laboratory of quiet comfort. Clove-stuffed gauze, honey pastes, cold linen wraps infused with camphor. Her ladies attended to her in the flicker of firelight, never speaking of the tenderness with which she winced when they touched her jaw. To admit pain was to admit weakness. And so the Queen never did. Only once, in a letter to an intimate friend, did she mention it indirectly. The days grow colder, and my head is heavy. My mouth does not favour this season. Nothing more. Yet her teeth told the story no letter could. Some had blackened. Others shifted. There were gaps, though they were hidden well. Her lips trained over decades to rest in the most flattering position. A physician once proposed extraction of a molar causing her particular agony. She refused. When he insisted, she allowed him to perform the procedure, not on her, but on one of her ladies, in her presence. A demonstration. The lady screamed. Elizabeth never mentioned the procedure again, and she never had the tooth pulled. Instead, she adjusted her diet. She requested softer foods, stewed apples, pottage, eggs, finely mashed peas. She avoided crusty bread, biting only the inner portions. Meat was shredded before it reached her plate. She drank warm possets, wine and milk mixed with spices, to ease digestion and comfort the gums. And always she sweetened her breath. Her tongue was brushed gently each morning with a soft cloth, her lips anointed with balm, her mouth rinsed with herbal teas. And between audiences, she often held a clove-studded pomander to her nose, breathing in the scent of her own carefully crafted illusion. But those closest to her knew. They saw the way she adjusted her jaw when standing, the slight tilt of her head when speaking, the way her eyes hardened ever so slightly when the pain surged. And yet, they never spoke of it, because the Queen never faltered. Even in discomfort, she ruled. Even in silence, she spoke volumes. In the later years of her reign, portraits of Elizabeth show her smiling less and less. Her mouth is closed, her expression distant, her face still radiant with paint and jewels, but her smile, that once bright symbol of youth, is hidden. And perhaps that was by design. For Elizabeth understood that the mouth, above all else, betrayed. It was where the body's frailty first appeared, where decay whispered loudest, where mortality made its quiet entrance. And so she covered it, masked it, sweetened it, controlled it. There are records of her gifting her own custom breath tinctures to favoured courtiers, small bottles wrapped in silk, sealed with wax, accompanied by handwritten notes. They were not just tokens of favour, they were instructions, guidance on how to maintain grace in a world that threatened to rot from within. Even in death, her mouth was treated with care. Her body, prepared for state viewing, was anointed with rose oil and wrapped in fine linen. Her lips were painted lightly, just enough to restore their shape. The mouth was closed, the teeth unseen. And in the coffin, sachets of crushed violet, mint and sage were tucked beneath her chin and breast, ensuring that even in the silence of eternity, the scent of the Queen would remain sweet. Today, no teeth of Elizabeth Tudor remain, no relics of enamel or bone. But her breath, its echoes, still float through the documents, the portraits, the memories left behind by those who once leaned close enough to catch a whisper. And they say it was sweet. Because it had to be. Because it was chosen. Because it was hers. Now, as the fire dims and sleep presses gently at your shoulders, picture her seated in the velvet chair by the hearth, a cloth pressed to her cheek, a lozenge dissolving on her tongue, her eyes closed, not from pain, but from calculation. The scent of clove rises into the air, her lips closed, her crown steady, and in the next breath, we descend beneath the finery, to the skin, the heat, the creases where fabric met flesh, to the itches no powder could stop, to the secrets that lived beneath the lace. The Queen rarely scratched. It was one of her many disciplines, learned early, practiced often, perfected over time. Scratching, after all, suggested discomfort, and discomfort was human. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, was not to be human. She was to be composed, untouchable, unshaken. But beneath the embroidered lace of her collars, she itched. Beneath the silk of her sleeves, beneath the brocade and the powder and the layers of perfumed linen, her skin burned. Sometimes faintly, sometimes fiercely, sometimes with a slow, gnawing insistence that turned seconds into hours. And she bore it, silently, exquisitely, because to acknowledge it would be to acknowledge that all the lace and velvet in the world could not keep the body still. The Queen's skin was her battlefield. It had endured decades of powder, paste, friction, and the weight of garments designed not for comfort, but for spectacle. Her gowns were works of architecture, stitched with stiffened canvas, framed with whalebone, weighed down with pearls, sometimes reaching 40 pounds in total. They did not move with the body. They demanded that the body move around them. Each morning, after her linen was wrapped, her layers were built, a tightly laced bodice pressed against her ribs. Sleeves were drawn snug over her arms. The great lace ruff, sprayed and starched into perfect fans, rose around her neck, grazing her jawline. It was a marvel, a symbol, a restraint, and under all of it was skin. Skin that did not breathe, skin that perspired, then dried, then itched, skin that rubbed against metal and thread, against stays and seams, skin that cracked in winter and wept in summer, skin that bore the private cost of public majesty. At first, the irritation came in patches, a dryness near the elbows, a tenderness at the neckline. Her ladies applied creams, scented oils, soft muslins. But the powders that came next, the layers of starch, the orris root, the lead, undid the work. Then came the rash beneath the arms. It was not spoken of directly, not in her presence. In notes exchanged between her women and the court physician, it was called the heat, or the disturbance. At times it was soothed with violet butter, a salve of violet petals and fresh cream, applied gently with cotton. Other times, the Queen requested no treatment at all, choosing to bear the sensation rather than appear as though she needed comfort. But the itch remained. And as she aged, it spread. The back of her knees, the folds at her waist, the curve of her shoulder blades where the stays pressed tightest. Each bend and crease of her body became a place where heat gathered, sweat lingered, and friction whispered itself into inflammation. The materials of her clothing did not help. Brocade and velvet, rich in texture and colour, held warmth. Embroidery, heavy with metal thread, chafed the skin. The Queen's underlayers, shifts and chemises, were meant to soften the contact, but they could only do so much. And the sweat they absorbed each day became, in its own way, another source of discomfort. Some days, the itching was so constant that her ladies noted her hand resting, for just a second too long, at her side. Never scratching, just resting, applying the slightest pressure as if to hush the skin without drawing attention. At night, in private, she allowed more relief. Her bodice unlaced, her ruff removed, her sleeves drawn back, the fire stoked low, and in its warmth, her ladies set about the delicate task of comforting the Queen's skin. They dabbed her with cool cloths soaked in chamomile or lily water. They rubbed her back with lavender oil and violet balm. They used their fingers, never brushes, moving slowly in soft circular motions. They spoke in whispers, or not at all. The Queen rarely spoke either. She would close her eyes and let the silence work its healing. But the morning always returned, and with it, the layers. The Queen could not appear before her court in a shift. She could not rule from her chambers wearing a balm. She had to rise, to dress, to become again the sovereign untouched by discomfort. And so, the itching returned. Sometimes her skin broke. Small blisters along her waist where corset strings rubbed too tightly. Redness at the elbows. A sore beneath the chin from where her starched ruff pressed upward. These were dressed with care, covered, never spoken of, always disguised. Her apothecary created powders to help, blends of starch, chalk, and ground herbs. These were dusted along her arms and legs before she dressed. But they too brought dryness. The relief came at a price, and through it all, she remained composed, even in the summer months. When the court moved to Greenwich or Nonsuch to escape the heat, the layers remained. The public never saw her neck, her arms, her legs. No skin was exposed save her hands and face, and even these were rarely bare. At court gatherings, she sat beneath a canopy, the lace of her sleeves reaching to her knuckles. her collar arching high around her jaw. She gestured gracefully, the scent of rosewater trailing her movements. She looked divine, but beneath the lace, she itched. There were whispers, of course, servants who noticed changes in her step, a slower walk, a shift in posture, a red mark at her wrist when her glove was removed. Nothing scandalous, just small signs, clues that even a queen must answer to the body. Still, she gave them nothing. She danced when required. She stood for hours in court. She accepted letters, gifts, poems, all with hands that trembled only slightly, skin that bore the weight of years and silence. There was no public scratching, no visible flinch. She had trained herself to stillness, to wear discomfort as she wore her crown. And yet, in her most private moments, on nights when the itching became unbearable, she sometimes asked her ladies for a basin of warm milk and petals. This was not for drinking, it was for soaking. A soft cloth would be dipped into the mixture, then pressed gently against her skin. The heat opened the pores, the milk soothed. The petals, rose, marigold, or violet, added scent and softness. No one else entered on those nights. The doors were closed, the fire burned low, and Elizabeth, no longer queen, but woman, allowed herself to be touched by something other than lace and power. She never cried, she never groaned. But her ladies knew, by the deepness of her breath, by the stillness of her face, that she was grateful. When the ritual was over, the cloths were burned, the basin emptied, the memory vanished with the smoke. By dawn, she was the queen again, powdered, laced, composed. The itching would begin anew, but the night had given her a few hours of peace, and that was enough. It was always enough. For Elizabeth Tudor had never expected ease. She had not been born into comfort. She had fought for her crown, fought for her image, fought for every inch of respect and power she held, and in doing so, she had accepted that her body would pay the price. So, she bore the itches, the sores, the red patches, the friction burns, the stinging from herbs, the flaring from starch, the endless war between cloth and skin. She bore them all, because to complain was to give them power, and she had no power to spare. Now imagine her standing before a mirror. A fresh shift pressed to her shoulders, her arms extended, her collar being fastened behind her neck, the scent of orris root rising in the air. She does not flinch, she does not blink. The lace is stiff, but beautiful, and beneath it the skin itches, but she smiles. Because that, too, is power. Next, we step away from the skin and into the hands that bore it all. The servants who scented, dressed, powdered, and healed without a word. They moved like ghosts, soft shoes, lowered eyes, words held behind closed lips. The Queen's personal attendants, the ones permitted to enter her private quarters, to touch her garments, to breathe the same air she slept in, lived lives of ritual and restraint. They were not invisible, but they trained themselves to be almost. Their duty was not just to serve, but to disappear while doing so. And for Elizabeth Tudor, that was the highest gift, to be served without intrusion, aided without observation, touched without feeling watched. They were women, mostly, though a few men held trusted positions in her privy chamber. They came from noble families, hand-selected, their loyalty tested long before their first day in service. Many had grown up in court. Others had been raised near royal households, groomed for the delicate work of silent care. They were not just dressers or maids, they were guardians of illusion, and their hands always smelled faintly of something floral. It was not coincidence. In the Queen's chambers, no one entered unscented. Each attendant was assigned a personal sachet of dried herbs, lavender, rose, clove, sweet marjoram. Their gloves were dabbed with citrus oils, their aprons laundered daily in rosemary water. They rubbed their palms with scented pomades, and when preparing to touch the Queen, to lift a sleeve, to fasten a ruff, to sponge her cheek, they first passed their hands through a cloud of damask mist, prepared fresh each morning in a silver bowl beside her washstand. Because the Queen was not to be touched by sweat, not by earth, not by evidence of anyone else's life, only by scent and cloth and reverence. The hands that cared for her learned quickly. They knew how to lift a silk underskirt without wrinkling it, how to loosen a corset with one hand, how to brush a powdered wig without dislodging the starch. They knew how to prepare ointments without speaking, how to warm linens over coals without singeing, how to walk without creaking floorboards. More importantly, they knew when not to speak. Because silence was the sacred language of her chambers. If she winced while her bodice was tightened, they said nothing. If her ulcer had worsened overnight, they exchanged only glances. If her linens returned stained with blood or discharge, the laundress merely left a ribbon, red for blood, blue for inflammation, white for discharge, tied discreetly on the handle of the linen chest. And yet, for all their silence, these attendants knew her better than anyone in the realm. They saw her skin bare, not her courtiers, not her council. But these women, these servants with scented hands, they saw the marks of time upon her, the softness of her belly, the hollows beneath her collarbones, the thinning of her hair, the way her feet swelled after long days of standing in court. They knew how she carried pain, where she held tension, what music soothed her, what scent made her exhale. When she was very tired, she preferred neroli. When she felt powerful, rose and myrrh. When melancholic, the crushed petals of violet mixed with a hint of amber. They knew that in the hour before sleep, she did not like to be touched, only watched from a quiet corner, while she read by firelight or sat unmoving before the mirror. Some of the attendants were with her for decades. Mistress Blanche, who had first combed her hair as a young girl, now carried her oils and arranged her dressing cloths. Mistress Cordelia, once a novice laundress, was promoted to manage the Queen's powder stores, a sign of great trust. There was Elias, the silent-footed chamber page, who brought warm water for her vinegar soaks and never once broke eye contact when she spoke directly to him, which she rarely did. They did not call her Elizabeth. They did not call her my lady. She was always Her Majesty, or simply she, even among themselves. She will need the rose oil tonight. She asked for the thin shift. She was restless last evening, and she was always obeyed. But obedience was not love. And yet, in the quiet corners of their labor, love was sometimes found. In the way they folded her gowns, in the way they cooled her tea to the precise temperature, in the way they pressed their palms gently against her forehead when the fever returned, staying until her breathing slowed, in the way they wept, not openly, but in hallways and laundry rooms, when she grew too still. They watched her life fade in increments, not through proclamation, not through scandal, but through softness. A longer pause before she stood, a shorter walk to the window, a deepening crease between her brows. They responded by refining their service. Her bed was turned more gently. Her shifts were stitched with finer seams. Her face cloths soaked longer in lavender to cool the heat of her cheeks. And through it all, they kept the rhythm, because that is what service to Elizabeth demanded. Not just devotion, but rhythm. Each hour had its task, each movement, its ritual. In the morning, her dressing began not with garments, but with silence. A period of quiet observation as the Queen sat in her chair, wrapped in a warm shawl, watching the fire. Then came the rose water, then the linen, then the corset, tightened in stages, then the powder, the rouge, the wig, the collar, the jewellery. Each item passed hand to hand with the precision of a priesthood, each movement laced with breath and scent. And never, never was a voice raised. It was a sanctuary. And yet, outside those rooms, the world believed it knew the Queen best. Ministers quoted her letters. Ambassadors described her gestures. Portraitists claimed to capture her essence, but they only saw her from afar. It was her attendants, those with scented hands and quiet hearts, who knew how she truly lived. They were the first to see her each morning, and they would be the last. When the time came, when her breath slowed, and her body no longer responded to rose oil or warmth, or whispered prayers, it was these same hands that prepared her for death. They laid her on linen. They removed the wig. They wiped her face with violet water. They closed her mouth. They painted her lips with the faintest trace of berry. They folded her fingers over a small cross. And then they bathed her. Not with vinegar, not with cloth, but with warm water. Just once, the first and only time she was bathed with water by human hands. And those hands did not tremble, because they had loved her, in silence, in service, in rhythm. And the Queen, for all her distance, had allowed it. Afterward, the cloths were burned, the gloves buried, the rose oil sealed away. And still, for weeks, her chambers carried the scent, not of death, but of everything she had been. Power, cleanliness, control, restraint, devotion, and just beneath it, humanity. Now, as night falls fully and you feel the weight of rest drawing near, picture those hands, smoothing a collar, folding a shift, holding a vial of oil to the light, not for glory, not for recognition, but because the Queen had trusted them to keep the world from seeing what lay beneath the lace. Next, we turn to those outside the inner circle, to the courtiers who watched from the edge, whispering their observations and gossip into the walls of power. They rarely saw her up close, and yet they spoke of her constantly. The courtiers, noblemen and noblewomen alike, orbited Queen Elizabeth like the moons of some celestial body, basking in her radiance, fearful of her shadows, and forever whispering about what they could not touch. They came in jewels and feathers, in perfumes and politics, bearing flattery like armour and smiles like knives. Their words dripped with deference in her presence, but once outside her sight, behind the tapestries, and beyond the latticework screens, their tones shifted. Because at court, the true currency was not gold. It was information, and there was no greater prize than the hidden truths of the Queen's body. They speculated endlessly, not out of malice, not always, but because in a world where everything about Elizabeth was calculated, any unguarded detail became precious, dangerous, useful. And so the corridors of Whitehall, of Richmond, of Hampton Court, they carried more than footsteps. They carried gossip. She hasn't shown her face since Tuesday. Her smile seemed tight today. Perhaps the tooth again. I heard she fainted after the mask. They say she stood too long in the heat. That powder she wears, surely it's not healthy. Have you seen how pale she's become? It was never spoken too loudly, never within earshot of anyone who mattered, but it filtered like smoke through the court, soft, poisonous, impossible to contain. No one admitted to starting the rumours. They simply passed along what they'd heard. A glance here, a missing court appearance there, the occasional delay of an audience or sudden retreat from the gardens. Whispers grew quickly. Even a shift in perfume, a heavier ambergris, a new clove-laced oil might spark speculation. Was it meant to mask something? Has the queen begun to decay beneath her silks? Of course, none dared say it aloud. To speak ill of the queen's person, her body, her scent, her routines, was high treason in spirit if not in law. Punishments varied: a sudden removal from favour, exclusion from court festivities, the end of a marriage proposal, the loss of a title. And yet, they spoke, because they were human, and because her silence, her perfect poise, her curated mystery, was too much to bear without invention. In an age where the monarch was both flesh and symbol, Elizabeth blurred the lines so thoroughly that her courtiers ached for contradiction. They longed to see her falter, not because they hated her, but because they needed to know she was real. So they watched. They took note of the extra layer of powder on a certain morning, the slight tremor in her hand as she raised her goblet, the wince that flickered for just an instant when she rose from her chair. One noblewoman, Lady W., was said to keep a secret journal of observations. Hidden in a locked casket, it recorded her speculations on the Queen's routines. When she changed her gloves, what time she dined, which scent she favoured on Sundays. It was never found, but the rumour of its existence stirred both fear and fascination. Because in that court, knowing, or pretending to know, gave power. Those closest to the Queen rarely indulged in such games. They were silent by necessity, their loyalty both expected and enforced. But those at the periphery, the social climbers, the diplomats, the aspiring poets, and banished heirs, they filled their hours with talk, and the body of the Queen became their favourite subject. It was said that her wig slipped once during a gust of wind in the garden, and 3 ladies nearly fainted at the sight of her bare scalp, that a court physician was dismissed for suggesting she wear less lead paint, that she refused to be seen eating meat after dusk, that she once wore the same shift for 5 days to test her attendants' loyalty. None of it could be proven. Most of it was nonsense. But it mattered little, because in Elizabeth's court, image was gospel, and anything that contradicted it, even faintly, became thrilling, irresistible. Even the foreign ambassadors were drawn into the game. Letters from the Spanish and French embassies record strange fascinations. Her Majesty's hands appear thinner than last year. The perfume is stronger now, perhaps to disguise illness. She leans more heavily on the chair arm. I wonder if her joints trouble her. These reports, sent across the sea, became political tools. For if Elizabeth was failing in health, she might be weaker in negotiation. And so the rumours rippled, from the Queen's dressing room, through the palace halls, into Europe and beyond. Some reached the ears of playwrights, satirical plays, performed in secret, mocked royal figures with whispers of bodily decay. The Virgin with the worm in her core, one such pamphlet called her, a dangerous insult that could have meant death for the author. Still, it circulated, quietly, wrapped in cloth, read only by candlelight, then burned. Even among her admirers, the tension between myth and flesh was palpable. Poets praised her with impossible metaphors, her skin, the moon's own silk, her breath, a garden in midsummer. But behind the words was always the question, How much of it was true? Did her skin still glow beneath the paint? Did her hair, what was left of it, still shine with copper? Did she still walk the corridors alone at night? Or was she now carried? These questions were never answered. And that was the point. Elizabeth understood that mystery held more power than truth. She never denied the rumors. She never acknowledged them. She simply continued, appearing when she chose, vanishing when she pleased, always one step ahead of curiosity. But she heard them. Of course she did. She heard the whispers, the subtle shifts in tone, the careful glances. And she responded, not with words, but with precision. When a courtier dared suggest she looked tired, she appeared the next morning in her boldest gown, draped in rubies, her wig curled high, her scent trailing behind her like a challenge. When rumors of her illness spread during a hot summer, she held court outdoors, standing beneath the sun for hours, smiling, unmoved, undefeated. And when her birthday came, and some wondered if she would forgo the traditional dance, she danced, slowly, gracefully, but she danced. Her courtiers applauded and whispered, because in their hearts they knew she had heard them, and she had answered. It was not only the Queen they gossiped about each other, of course. The Duke's daughter with the falling hem, the ambassador's wife who wore too much rouge, the boy who cried when touched by the Queen's dog. But gossip about Elizabeth, that was different. It carried danger, but it also carried heat. Because to speak about her body, even in jest, was to place oneself closer to it, to imagine for a moment being near the mystery, to pretend, just for a whisper's length of time, that you had touched what no one else could. And so the gossip continued, not to wound her, but to feel her, to grasp in some small way the outline of a sovereign who had made herself more myth than woman. Now, imagine those halls, the stone cool beneath your feet, the tapestry gently stirring from a breeze beneath the floorboards. A pair of courtiers leaning close, their voices hushed, their eyes flicking toward the Queen's chamber door. A name, a word, a fragment of suspicion passed like a spark between them. And behind that heavy oak door, silence, stillness, and a Queen already dressing for tomorrow, already preparing to remind them all why they could only ever whisper. Next, we move toward the end of the masque, to the final illusion held even in death, and to the legacy of a body shaped by myth. Death had always been near. In her youth, it stalked her lineage. In her rise to power, it hovered like a vulture, and throughout her reign, it rode in with every letter sealed in wax, every cough from a servant, every poorly timed summer fever. Elizabeth they had survived threats from abroad, betrayals within, and the endless march of time, all without once being publicly undone. And so, when the end did come, it was not declared, it was managed. As with all things in her life, her passing was not merely an event. It was an extension of her mythology. Quiet, controlled, choreographed. Even in her final days, the Queen's body remained a kingdom, and that kingdom could not be allowed to fall. In the last weeks of her life, Elizabeth rarely spoke. She took little food. Her strength faltered, but her will, iron hard, sharpened by a lifetime of solitude and spectacle, did not break. She refused to take to her bed, sleeping instead in a chair by the fire, still upright, still sovereign, still insisting upon the image she had worn for nearly half a century. She did not want to be seen horizontally. She did not want to be seen failing. Even her closest attendants, Those trusted with her most intimate rituals were not permitted to utter the word sick in her presence. They referred to her weariness as heaviness, her lack of appetite as abstinence, her thinness as refinement. In those twilight days, her dressing rituals were shortened, her gown simpler, her face less painted, but the illusion still stood, even if only by breath and willpower. It is said that toward the very end, she wore a plain white gown and a wig threaded with silver instead of gold. A deliberate choice, perhaps, one final transformation, not into a ghost, but into an icon. Courtiers waited in anxious quiet. Messages were sent and delayed. Prayers were said, though not aloud. And finally, when she could no longer rise, when her breath had slowed to a feather's touch, the queen, who had ruled alone, remained unmarried, and outlived all her rivals, was allowed at last to lay down her crown. She died in silence, and in that silence the work began, not of mourning, but of preservation. Her death could not be allowed to unravel what she had spent decades constructing. Not her reputation, not her image, and certainly not her body. The attendants moved quickly and reverently. First, the chamber was sealed. Only a handful of women were permitted to enter. The room was still warm from the fire. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something sharper, perhaps the last of her rose oil, perhaps the strange scent of something else passing away. The queen's body remained upright for a time, her hands folded, her eyes closed by a single gloved attendant who had once dressed her for coronations. Then the final dressing began. It was not a washing, at least not in the way most understood it. There was no soap, no splashing, no immersion. Instead, her body was cleansed with cloths soaked in white wine and crushed violets. Her limbs were wiped gently, each movement slow, careful, like the turning of a page long unread. Her feet were covered with fine wool. Her mouth was sealed with a silk ribbon. Her hair, such as it remained, was combed and covered beneath a wig of soft auburn, curled like spring ivy and dusted lightly with powdered gold. She was powdered again. Her final ceruse, thin this time, more symbolic than functional. The lead paste, now less about illusion than tradition, was applied to smooth the skin along her cheeks and chin. It concealed the sharp angles time had carved and returned to her, for a moment, the face of majesty. Her lips were touched with crushed berry balm. Her hands were gloved in white satin, fingers curled just slightly, as if to hold the air. And then her final gown. It was not the golden robe of state, nor the scarlet velvet of victory. It was white, a vision of silence. The fabric was embroidered with silver thread, woven with tiny roses and Tudor knots. Around her neck, a ruff, crisp, impossibly clean, starched with a mixture of rice flour and egg white, just as she had preferred in life. Over her chest, a small crucifix. Around her, sachets of her favoured scents: violet, rosemary, clove. And within the folds of her gown, they placed a single note, unmarked, unread, known only to those who laid it there. Some say it was a prayer. Others say it was her own last words, written days earlier and sealed in silence. Once the body was fully dressed, the attendants wept, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in corners, in stairwells, in the folds of sleeves, because they had not merely served a monarch, they had helped sustain a miracle. And now, that miracle had become still. When the body was shown, it was not in decay. It was preserved by myth. Visitors saw not death, but sovereignty, not absence, but permanence. The queen lay as she had lived, immaculate, unreachable, composed. Even the light that struck her face through the stained glass windows seemed softened, as though the sun itself knew not to intrude too harshly upon a legend. Of course, beneath the powder and the perfume, the truth still rested. The body had aged, the skin had thinned. There were bruises along the arms, not from violence, but from fragility. The lips were cracked, the gums sunken, the hands once graceful, now delicate and frail. But no one saw this. No one was permitted to speak of it. And so the queen became eternal. In portraits commissioned after her death, artists were instructed to draw from earlier works, to depict her as she had appeared in youth and power, never in weakness. There was no official record of her final state, no public death mask, no anatomical study. Instead, she remained painted, ageless, her likeness carried forward into centuries, and with that, her body, never fully seen, became a relic of speculation. Historians would later ask, what ailments did she suffer? Was it lead poisoning that slowed her step? Was it cancer that dulled her voice? How did she move beneath the gowns? What did her skin look like beneath the rouge? But the answers would never come, because the myth had outlived the woman, and that, perhaps, was the point. Elizabeth had always known that the body betrayed. It aged, it bled, it failed. But image could endure, and so she had built her own temple, one of powder and silence, of lace and posture, of ceremony and restraint. Even in death she ruled it. She became not the queen who died, but the queen who had always been. And in doing so, she gave her people a final gift, a memory untouched by decay. Now, as the candle's flame softens to its final flicker, and the palace corridors fall quiet for the last time, picture her lying in state, her hands folded, her eyes closed, her scent still there, faint, familiar, permanent, a queen, preserved, not by oils or potions, but by the myth she had woven around herself, tighter than any corset, higher than any ruff, more lasting than any crown. Next, we arrive at the final chapter, not of the queen's body, but of her legacy, of what remains, of how she lingers in cloth, in memory, in breath. She has not moved in centuries. Her breath has long since quieted. Her heart, once heavy with power, now rests still beneath stone. The gowns she wore have frayed. The perfumes have faded. The body, once guarded, perfumed, powdered, wrapped in linen and legend, has surrendered to the earth. And yet, she remains, not in flesh, but in feeling, in the folds of fabric stored in museums, yellowed and delicate, bearing the faint scent of old rose and starch, in the letters she wrote, where every curve of ink was guided by a hand gloved in violet-scented leather, in the silver combs, the glass vials, the pressed flowers tucked between pages of books once turned by her fingers. Elizabeth I may have passed from the world of the living, but her touch lingers still, not on the throne, not on parchment, but in the air of memory itself. And that is how myths survive. Not in proof, but in presence. Not in what is measured, but in what is felt. To this day, visitors to Westminster Abbey pause before her tomb. Some come with reverence, some with curiosity. Some come not for her at all, only to wander among kings and stone angels, and find themselves halted unexpectedly, drawn to the carved effigy of a woman who still commands silence. She lies there in full regalia, carved in marble, her face serene. A ruff encircles her neck, impossible to crease. Her gown is adorned with carved jewels. Her hands are folded over her chest. No sign of discomfort, no whisper of decay. Only calm, only stillness, only the image she chose. But beneath that sculpture, within the vault below, the real Elizabeth rests, or what remains of her. Bones, cloth, dust, a life once lived so fully in restraint. We do not see that part. We are not meant to, because Elizabeth Tudor designed her legacy not for dissection, but for devotion. She understood something few ever do, that history remembers not the bare body, but the crafted presence. And oh, how she crafted it! Everything she touched was transformed. Not into gold, perhaps, but into narrative. A simple cloth became a symbol of discipline. A wig became a crown. A glove, scented and gifted, became an act of diplomacy. Even silence, that powerful, curated silence, became its own form of speech. She left no children, no direct heir to carry her likeness. And yet her face became one of the most reproduced in all of English history. Artists were instructed not to paint her as she was, but as she should be remembered. Each brushstroke a veil, each canvas a shrine. Even today, when her name is spoken, we picture not the woman as she truly was, aged, aching, slowly slipping into quiet, but as she presented herself, glowing, red-haired, ruffled and regal, eyes that do not blink, a smile that hides more than it reveals, and in that image, perfect, enduring, we find the last evidence of her touch, not on others, but on herself. Elizabeth was her own creation, not in vanity, but in survival. In a world ruled by men, in a palace filled with spies, in a kingdom ever shifting beneath her feet, she built a body of myth around the body she was given. She cared for it not with indulgence, but with strategy. Every ointment was a weapon, every layer of linen a shield, every perfume a spell, and those who served her, the silent chamberlains, the scented attendants, the trembling physicians, the linen keepers. They did not merely tend to a woman. They preserved an idea. It is tempting to ask what she left behind, to search her body, now long gone, for answers, to wonder what her bones might say about her illnesses, what her teeth might tell us about her diet, what her hair, if found, might whisper of arsenic or mercury or lead. But perhaps it is better not to know. Perhaps mystery is its own kind of truth. For Elizabeth did not wish to be understood. She wished to be believed. And we did. We still do. She is taught as the virgin queen, the warrior queen, the scholar, the orator, the monarch who turned England toward the light of a new age. But in all the tales of her mind and might, we forget the quietest part of her reign, the part she guarded most fiercely, her body. The limbs she never revealed, the sores she disguised, the breath she sweetened, the sleep she resisted, the itches she never scratched, the silence she wore like silk. And perhaps, in this final moment, that is what we remember most, that her touch was never about what she gave to others, but about how she shaped herself, day after day, layer by layer, until what was underneath no longer mattered, only what was seen, only what was believed. And now, as sleep presses softly against your thoughts, let the noise of centuries fade. Let the rustle of velvet quiet. Let the scent of rose and dust and memory drift through the chamber. The queen is gone, but her touch remains, in legend, in ritual, in the lace that still whispers across the necks of women who never knew her, in the perfume of a letter long unread, in the quiet discipline of standing tall even when one is tired, in the decision to carry pain with grace, in the art of choosing who sees you and who never will. Let her rest now. Let the fire dim, let the rough loosen. Let the last of the powder fall away like snow from a window sill. And let you too drift now into sleep, into stillness, carrying with you not the weight of her crown, but the softness of her silence. Good night, Your Majesty, and good night to you.